much, and thank you for inviting me and offering me the platform. In real terms, it means it's a number on a scroll in Leicester Avenue Liberal Synagogue, where we have the Brandýs scroll, and it came from the Westminster Trust, and they acquired 1,564 scrolls in about 1961 through the auspices of a man called Eric Stock, I think was his name. He was an art dealer and he had a lot of business in Prague. And after the war, all the scrolls were assembled. They were stored in different places, along with other artifacts from the destroyed communities of Bohemia. And he ransomed all of them with the aid of a philanthropist. And they brought them to London and they were stored in the Westminster Synagogue, where they set up a trust for these scrolls. And then a lot of them had to be repaired. Lovely story, in fact, that one day, well, they looked at the scrolls and some were in bad condition, some were in good condition, and some were not, so middling condition. And so they didn't know what they were going to do with the ones in bad condition. But one day there was a knock on a door, and it was a sofer, and he said to them, "Do you have any scrolls for, or any work for a sofer?" So they said, "Please come in." And they brought him in. I think he's still there working on them. Now, they distributed the scrolls around the world to people who applied for them, and I think they paid them a small, modest deposit. In all, there were 11 scrolls made in Brandýs. And of the 11 scrolls, 7 are in America. One is in Dublin, one's in Amsterdam, one's in Jerusalem, and one's in London. On the bottom left-hand roller, there is a brass thumb plate, and on it is the number 373, which is the number allotted by the trust to that scroll. On the top right-hand roller, well, let's have a look at the scroll first of all, sorry. That's the scroll. I couldn't photograph the roller because the whole text at the moment is on the left-hand roller because of the time of year, and it wouldn't be possible. But let's have a look at the top of the right-hand roller. Now there is a number in red paint which is actually number 1728. It's not 1729, 1728. And that number was given to the scroll by the Nazis. It was painted on the scroll by them. And that was indexed, and then from that index we're able to establish that the scroll came from Brandýs. When the scroll arrived in Dublin, we received with it a certificate from the Westminster Trust. I don't know if you can read that. I don't even know if I can read it. But at the bottom of what's important here, it says, this scroll was made in Brandýs in 1900. So it is in fact it's quite a recent scroll. Now, why am I talking about it? About 5 years ago, or perhaps less, Rabbi Goldstein was taking the services in Leicester Avenue, and he comes from Northwood and Pinner Synagogue, which also has scrolls from the Czech Republic, as it is today. The principal scroll comes from Kolín. And a number of years ago, they undertook a project as a result of something that children had been doing, and they started a project of research into the scroll. And they found out quite a lot about their scroll, and they have published a small pamphlet on it. And Andrew, during his sermon on Rosh haShanah, laid down the gauntlet to us and he said, "You have a scroll from Czech Republic, you have a scroll from Brandýs, what do you know about it?" And there were a lot of blank faces. And he said, "Well, find out everything you can about the scroll, find out everything you can about the people of Brandýs, do the research, do the work. I'm going to give you some material to start you off, but somebody take up the challenge and find out everything you can about Brandýs. So I took up the challenge and I spent about 2.5, 3 years trying very hard to research it. The actual information on Brandýs is very little, and there's not a lot to be said about Brandýs. So the history in Gold's History of Jews of Europe is literally only 2 pages. And in a book that was published by the Czech government on various communities, it's just 1.5 pages. Andrew then invited us, people from the community, anyone who wanted to go. He said, let's go back to Brandýs, let's give it some life. So 6 of us from Dublin went back to Brandýs with Andrew Goldstein and Sharon, and 6 came from Amsterdam. So we were a delegation of 14. We began in Prague, and then after Prague we took a minibus down to Brandýs, which is about 20 kilometers from Prague. It's a half an hour, 40-minute drive through fairly flat countryside, and then you arrive into Brandýs. So this is a view of the square of Brandýs as it is today, and the building, the cream building at the top, is the mayor's office. And on Friday afternoon, we arrived on Friday at lunchtime, a bit after lunch, and Friday at 4 o'clock we had a meeting with the mayor of Brandýs. We had a meeting with the mayor in his office, delegation. We were there on the right-hand side. Carla's on the left, Hillary beside her, and the mayor is the 3rd person next to Hillary. Next to him is a lady, she's the deputy mayoress, and next to that is the president of the community of Prague. And then I think there are some people from Holland at the end of the table. We also had an interpreter and other people who helped. Now, we had a terrific meeting with the mayor, which we exchanged gifts and so forth, and we had discussion. And after the meeting, this photograph is of the Millrace in Brandýs. Brandýs is on the Labem, which is also known as the Elbe. It's a powerful river which has been harnessed for a long time, and there is a mill race. And underneath the castle, I'll show you a photograph from the castle balcony, which was taken at night and looking up the left-hand bank of the river. And as we walked along there during the day, it occurred to me that this was where the first Jews settled in Brandýs. Because what the story tells us is that they may have been invited into Brandýs, or they may have arrived from Prague. Nobody knows how they got there or why. But they were permitted to settle under the castle on the left bank by the mill race. And suddenly when you're walking along under the trees, you remember that bit of history, and it comes alive, suddenly comes really alive. So it's somewhere there. And there's the castle, there's the river, and you can see some houses here, here, and here. So it could be anywhere in that area where the first Jews settled in Brandýs. The year that they arrived in Brandýs was 1515. A very small number of them arrived. Now we're going to go back a moment, because following the route we took with the mayor, we went first to the cemetery. This is the cemetery as it has been for a very long time. Inside is the Beit Olam. There was also premises, an apartment for the beadle or shamus, and for the caretaker. So let's have a look at the cemetery, because it's probably that's the inscription over the door of the house. And then we have a look at some of the cemetery itself. It's extremely beautiful. Originally it was founded in about 1568, which is actually quite surprising. If the community was founded in 1515, then a gap of 50 years before the cemetery is created is a very, very long time. But not only that, this was an Orthodox community, and it would not have been in accordance with Orthodox laws to found the cemetery after the synagogue. Strictly speaking, the cemetery is founded first, and then the synagogue is founded after the cemetery. Some close-ups of stones. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of stones, a huge variety, everything from a very common plain carved stone to a baroque, quite an ornate stone. They took some of the stones from the ground and they implanted them in the wall, and these are some of the stones implanted in the wall. I have no explanation as to why that happened. I want you to look at this, because this is an area of space at the back of the cemetery. Again, very beautiful with the trees. And then another area, we're looking towards the end of the cemetery. And what is, I suppose, the most moving thing of the cemetery is you reach 1942, and there's a line right across the entire plot. And from there to the end is a huge space, but it's empty. And it was obviously intended that this was going to be a community that would grow and flourish. It would need a lot of space in the cemetery. The cemetery was expanded many times, but it was expanded most recently in the last 15 years, as far as I can gather. Twice. So the cemetery went from 2,000 meters square in its original form, and it is now 6,800 meters square. First burial was in 1568, and it was for Yosef ben Yitzchak. The last burials was for Mr. Siedemann and Mrs. Lustikova in 1942.
About the expansion of the cemetery, did that mean that more land was brought in, or was the whole original belonging to the community?
What I have is that a plot was added. 2 plots were added. It came under state control in 1973, and then after that, between 1990 and 2000, it would seem that 2 plots were acquired. But if it's already walled, then I'm not quite sure how that fits in. So that needs a bit more information. This building in beige is the synagogue. It's been on that site for several hundred years, but it has had the most terrible history, which I'll go into at various points along the way. However, we left the cemetery, went back to the hotel for change, and then we gathered on Friday night in the synagogue at about 7 o'clock. This is a restored synagogue. There has been a project funded by the EU and the Czech government to restore 10 synagogues in the Czech Republic. And Brandýs was one of them, and it was opened and finished just a few months before we arrived. There is no Torah in the ark, but the design and the structure of the synagogue is very much as it was. One of the particularly unusual features of the synagogue is it has 2 galleries, and one is an overflow gallery. And I've never seen that in any other place. This is the roof. Now, that photograph really doesn't give you any great idea. It's a deep blue with gold stars. It's a very beautiful ceiling. And this again, another view of the overflow gallery. And this is after the first service in 70 years. You know, it was one of the most amazing occasions to be there for the very first service after such a terrible history and such a long time. There were about 50 to 60 people at the service. It started with the mayor welcoming everybody and addressing the congregation. Rabbi Goldstein replied, and then a violinist played some Jewish music which he had interpreted and arranged himself. It was extremely good. And then Andrew conducted the service in English, of course. But the moment that the singing started with Ma Tarvu, it was like 60 phoenixes rising from the ashes. They just soared up into the roof of this synagogue, and it was quite an emotional experience. I should also tell you that by about 1547, there were 5 houses, and there was a mikveh in Joseph's house in 5 to 7 Stibirna Street. And it's interesting that the synagogue, the cemetery still had not been started at that point. Now, at this point, we have to really leave our visit to Brandýs and go into some of the history. Between 1526 and 1564, Ferdinand I was the ruler, and he came under terrible pressure from burghers and from the city council of Prague to expel the Jews because it was thought that they'd been buying stock in foreign-owned companies with capital which they had acquired in Bohemia and Moravia. And there was intense council pressure on the emperor. And Ferdinand seems to me to have been a rather weak man. He couldn't quite make up his mind whether he was going to protect them or whether he was going to expel them. And I think his instinct was that he wanted to keep them. But in actual fact, he ended up expelling them. And the expulsion was between 1559 and 1568. And on the 18th of July 1559, the Jews of Brandýs left for Poznan in Poland. Now, while they were away, they wrote to the authorities and they said to them, because they had at that time a school and a prayer house on the site, and it had a shingle roof. And they wrote and they said in their letter, "We reserve the right to return to our premises. We require you to look after them and not to allow anything that is unclean to be in them. And at most you can only store corn for the town." And they also said that if a single shingle falls from a roof, we expect it to be repaired. And for that they paid 20 groschen per annum. Well, they came back from Poznan between about 1567 and 1568. And at that time, 5 families are recorded. And then in 1570 to 78, 8 families are recorded. And when I say recorded, I mean they were paying taxes, known as a head tax. The Jews paid taxes to this crown estate and to the towns and to a lot of other people all the time that they lived in Brandýs up to pretty recent history. And they did so because by paying taxation, it enabled them to survive. Because the taxes were important to the state and extremely useful to the emperor. And in return for paying these taxes, the emperor gave them protection. There was a lot of pressure on the emperor, but this was how they got around it. And frequently, when there were problems, and serious problems which we'll touch on, they were able to get around these by buying protection, by paying somebody, and it enabled them to survive. Let's move forward to the Golden Age, as it's called, which is between 1564 and 1612. An interesting period. The emperors then were Maximilian, who was 1564 to 76, and Rudolf, who was 1576 to 1612. Now these two emperors cemented the position of the Jews in the Czech Republic, or in Bohemia rather. There seems to be a little bit of difference between Bohemia and Moravia. And things happened in Bohemia quicker than they did in Moravia. The Jews obtained security. They were permitted to expand, to develop. There was a promise made never to expel them again. They were permitted to expand into trades. They had up to then been engaged in financial activities such as lending money, pawnbroking and peddling. Well, the reason for that is simple. These are transportable businesses. You can't transport property. But they were able to expand into trades, into other forms of commerce, into arts and crafts. They could become merchants. The power of the Christian guilds was curtailed. And all in all, this could be described as partial emancipation for the Jews of Brandýs and for the Jews of Bohemia. In 1623, a privilegium was decreed, and that gave the Jews the freedom to reside, and it gave them protection from expulsion, and it allowed them unhampered trade and commerce in the kingdom. And in 1636, Ferdinand II refused a petition to remove the Jews or to withhold Jewish privileges. So in the 1630s, the population expanded throughout the kingdom. And then what happened was between 1618 and 1648, Ferdinand II became emperor, and historically there was always great tension between the Catholics and the Protestants. The emperors, and the Habsburgs in particular, were very Catholic in their outlook, some more so than others, but they were all extremely devout. And again, there was great pressure on the king, and there was huge tension, and war broke out between the king and the Protestants. This became known as the 30-Year War. And early on in this war was the Battle of the White Mountains. And that was a battle where a smaller number of the king's army defeated a larger number of the Protestant army. That war settled the way in which land was held in Bohemia for the next 300 years. And the war was largely paid for, or at least in part, was paid for with Jewish money. Because again, the Jews paid the crown, they sided with the king, they paid the crown substantial sums of money in way of taxes, possibly in donations, I don't know about that. And in return, they prospered after the war. The Jews of Brandýs in particular were able to buy new houses, they could move out of the area where they were living into new districts. And a street called Bäckergasse was established, which is Baker's Alley in English. And that area became known as the Judenstadt, or Jewtown. Now, at the end of that war, the Jews owned 13 estates. I'm not sure what the word estate means, whether it is land, whether it's houses, or what it means. In 1648, there was a Juden patent. And this was really rather a change of course for the Jews of Brandýs in particular. Jewish homes had to be sold to Christians. They were banned from living in the town. They were very serious decrees. The Prague people tried to intervene, were not successful, because the Bohemian exchequer forbade Jews to settle in Brandýs. And one of the indignities they had to endure at that time was complaints from butchers who feared trade from the Jews, competition. That seems to me to be a rather strange thing, because the Jews would have been koshering meat. They wouldn't have been selling to the Christians in the town. Whether that had any genuineness to it or not, I don't know. But it seems rather odd in the context of kashrut and non-kashrut meat. However, again, by the payment of some money, particularly the town of Brandýs, and to the captain of the castle, this was the chateau where we celebrated dinner on Friday night and Saturday night, which we'll go back to at the end of this lecture. There's a Captain Kastrad who assisted the Jews by protecting them. And in 1658, that decree was rescinded. Let me go back in time, because there were a number of things that happened in Brandýs to the community which were particularly nasty. There was an allegation made. The allegation was that the Jews were interfering with what's called the host in Catholicism, and they whipped up a storm against the Jewish community, and mobs rioted and burned down the synagogue. In one other text it's described that there were soldiers who burned it down. In either way, it was burnt in 1622. And they suffered further problems, because the Jewish quarter was burned in 1639. And then after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1647, after the Juden patent, the Jews left their houses in Brandýs and they became deserted. And in 1654 there were 14 deserted houses. 1656, a decree that Jewish houses be sold to Christians. They're banned from living in the town. Then there was a revival, and the population went from 9 men over 20 to 83 souls. And by 1723 there were 22 families. And throughout all of this period, or these periods, the Brandýs nobility did protect the Jews. Interestingly enough, they had to live in assigned streets. They had to wear specially cut cloth, and their children could not attend the same schools as other children. And I'm just wondering about the cut cloth, whether that was a precursor to the Nazi yellow star, or was it something that was quite common that Jews had to endure in Europe in those times. Their houses were numbered 1 to 12 in Roman numerals, whereas other houses had Arabic numerals. And we now know that the area where the houses were located were in streets called Nitsi Haradek, on the north side behind the mill stream. And today those streets are known as Na Potoci and Na Struze. And when they returned, I'm going back to 1658, I'm sorry I'm jumping around a bit. Jews returned but did not live on the square. A Jewish enclave or quarter was established in the inner town, which was later closed with a wire. And that would have been in accordance with halakha, as you could walk within the area enclosed with a wire on the Shabbat. So it does suggest that it was a very orthodox community. Let's move on to 1711, 1740. Emperor Karl VI was then the emperor, and he was particularly difficult for the Jews. He introduced something called the Familientengesetze, or the Familien's law, and he only permitted one son per family to marry. And the total number of Jews he permitted in Bohemia was limited to 8,541. But again, there was a dilemma, because he was getting good taxes from the Jewish communities, and he had a dilemma. But if he was going to expel them, he'd lose the taxes. If he curtailed them, he'd lose some of the taxes. So this was some sort of a compromise that he'd worked out in his head, that he could still maintain the tax revenue, but at the same time curtail the expansion of Jewish families and Jewish businesses. Now that unfortunate Familientengesetze remained until 1848. And then he was succeeded by his daughter Marie-Therese, 1740 to 1780, a very long reign. And she took a view very early on in her reign that the Jews sided with the Prussians during the occupation of Prague in 1744 and decided that they had to be punished. So she ordered their total expulsion of all Jews from Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia. That caused serious consternation. The English crown intervened and objected strenuously. Several other peoples intervened and objected. The Exchequer objected, obviously. We're going to lose huge revenue. And that decree was rescinded again quite quickly. And during that time, the Jews enjoyed the protection from the nobility in the countryside. They go on to Joseph from 1780 to 1790, who succeeded Marie-Therese during the period of Enlightenment. And at this point, the Jews in Bohemia and Moravia were speaking German. They had German names, and they had German behavioral patterns. But he introduced another law which was called the Tolerance Patent of 1781. Now this introduced reforms without giving the Jews any greater privileges, but it did sort of maintain the status quo which they'd had previously, and it restored them to some degree of stability, and it gave them economic expansion. They were enabled to open factories, to enter trade and commerce. They could engage in arts and crafts, and most of the people at that time were engaged in drapery. Others were engaged in tobacco, winemaking, colonial goods, and feathers. Big industry in feathers, which probably came from South Africa, from a town that Carol and I visited only about 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, called Oudtshoorn in the Little Karoo. It's the ostrich capital of the world. And in the museum in Oudtshoorn, you'll see wonderful clothes which used ostrich feathers as decoration and as capes and to make dresses. And quite exciting. They also engaged in butchery. And despite all of that, there were still some restrictions on the communities. But by 1850s, they were able to enter into professions. The populations rose and fell and rose and fell. By the late 19th century, the population of Brandýs was 250. But by 1930, the population was 60, with 20 non-registered. As you understand, even today in Germany, there is a Jewish tax. An awful lot of Jews in Germany don't pay the tax, and therefore they're not registered as Jews. But same situation pertained in Brandýs in the 1920s. There was 60 of them, sorry, in the 1930s there were 60 and 20 not registered. That is a very quick, potted history of the community of Brandýs. That on the 13th and the 16th of January in 1943, the people of Brandýs, together with people from other villages, were rounded and put on transports. Put on transports to Theresienstadt. Those that went to Theresen and Auschwitz, 48 are known to have died. And of those, there are 45 or 46 names here, and I think it would be appropriate for us to read them together, if it's possible. I don't know if you can see the screen. No. Well, what I'm going to do is hand this book around and invite each one of you to read a name and to keep handing it around until all the names are read. So the first name I'm going to read is Henrietta Bezichka.
Och nästa block
Carolina Blockova.
This is Anna Hanikova.
Wojciech Arnoldst.
Wojciech Arnoldst, Wojciech Arthur, Wojciech Eric.
Leo Koenig, Wilhelmina Konigova, and Egon Kraus, and Gustav Kraus.
Ottilie Krusarova, Oskar Laufar, Rudolf Laufar, Berta Laufarova.
František Löwit, Evsen Lustig, Hanuš Lustig, Josef Lustig, Karen Lustig.
Anna Listikova, Milina Listikova, Pavla Listikova.
Monika Masova, Adolf Munk, Olga Pikova.
Edmund Wagner, František Reiner, Richard Reiner, Anna Reinerova, and Marilda Reinerova.
Anna Swobiczek, Anna Wobiczkova, Hermina Shulkova, and Jana Sidmanova.
Arthur Stadler, Helena Stadlerova, Alzbeta Stasna, Hugo Stasny, Zdenka Stasny.
Milislav
Traum.
Trop,
And with Northern. Zdenko Traum.
Zdenko Trop, Hanna Trauberg,
Troborova.
Troberova,
Projektek Willem. Projektek Bedriska. Rakova Helena. Weistrova Anna.
Those people who died, let them never be forgotten. Let us remember them all the time. Go back to our visit to Brandýs in July 2014. And on Saturday night we had dinner in the castle. There was only the 8 of us at that point, 14 of us. And at the end of dinner, about 10:30, Andrew Goldstein said, "Come on, let's go on the balcony and make Havdolah." And this is a photograph of Andrew. Tim is holding the candle. That's Icky from Holland, Ifra Verms from Holland, and there we are making Havdolah. That was another stunning occasion. Just like Martavu, when the voices rose in the synagogue, but to making Havdolah on the balcony, under the stars, just getting dark, with Andrew, was a most perfect way to end, as we all intoned that wonderful tune, Lai Lai Ver Lai Lai. And in May, I was at the Berlin Brandenburg Plein Air Painting Festival, run by a friend of mine, Marco Fensky. And we were in a place called Altumen, which is 80 kilometers east of Berlin and 80 kilometers west of the Polish border. I had no idea where Altumen was or what it was. We went in the bus, we got there. It's a minute hamlet of about 20 houses, not a shop, not a post office,
no bus,
not a bar, not anything, just a few houses. And we discovered that Ravensbrück was across the road, at the other end of the lake of Fürstenberg. And Fürstenberg is a very beautiful little town. One end of the lake and on the other end of the lake was Ravensbrück. So of course we had to go. And while I was walking around, I did 2 drawings. These could sit in my sketchbook forevermore and they would never see the light of day. I think it's more appropriate that I have an association with this museum, being Irish. I've been in Ravensbrück, I did the drawings, and I think it would be appropriate for the museum to have them. I'd be very happy to present them to you.
Thank you very much indeed. We certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.